Oh boy.
When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
You're watching Adventures in Music Theory with your host, Dr. Robbins. So, welcome to Monday, May the 4th, the beginning of the last week of classes. Can you believe you people are almost done with me? The mind reels. All you got to do is get through one teensy tiny test and one teensy tiny huge honking exam, and you are through with me in my class. Of course, you're welcome to take others. But anyway, let's talk about things that are ahead of us for this week. Wednesday, you have a test on the last two units. And last week, I put up the Bach Fugue in F minor from Well-Tempered Clavier Volume 1. It's on Moodle and Google Classroom just waiting for you, so remember to access that. And I'll talk more about what you can and can't do with that movement at the end of this presentation. The other thing that's waiting for you on Moodle and Google Classroom is the optional, note the word optional, O-P-T-I-O-N-A-L, optional final project. If you decide to do the optional final project, it's due Friday, which is the last day of classes. If you don't do it, that's fine. Remember how the optional final project works is I basically take points from your test grades. I think the tests are 60% of the final grade, and there are 4 of them, so each one counts 15%. If you decide to take this optional final project, it's going to act like a 5th test would. And each one will get an even percentage of points, so it'll get 12%, and each test will be 12%. So basically, one thing it's good for is if you don't like your test grades, if you do the optional final project, each test grade will count less towards your final grade. But if you do it, that's great. If you don't do it, that's also great. It's your decision, and you don't need to tell me if you're doing it or not doing it. I'll figure that out by noticing whether or not I received it. So, let's move on and start talking about things. And the things I want to talk about today are variation procedures, specifically sectional variations, which are what we talked about last week on Friday after we'd covered continuous variations. So here goes. So, let's just discuss a little bit the homework assignment I left you with last time, because we talked last time about variation forms and particularly about sectional variation forms. So I thought that we would look at that Beethoven example that's in the textbook as an example of sectional variation types. And I'm not going to bother listening through it and going through every moment, but I have a very particular way I want to focus on it. But just to talk about how sectional variations work, that's the oh so popular theme and variations that we find out there. And remember that it's one of those things where you have a theme that's presented up front, and then you have a series of reimaginings or variations on that theme. And each one of those variations might have a very different character, might choose to have a different thing it does in the theme. Like if the theme is just quarter notes and eighth notes, you might very well have one variation that decides it's going to turn everything into solid 16th notes. Or you might have one theme that's going to decide that it's going to be a very lyrical, slow movement take on the variation, or on the theme. And then you might have one variation that's going to be a more character-driven version of the theme, like a folk dance or a march or something like that. And in a theme and variations, what happens is instead of just having a repeated pattern that things happen over, like happens in continuous variations. In a theme and variations, we have a very, very highly composed theme that often has a specific form and a specific way of being structured, and those things are retained in each variation. So if you have a ternary theme, then you're going to have a bunch of ternary variations. And if that ternary theme has a double period in its A section, then the A sections are going to be double periods in the variations. And Beethoven sort of works that way. Let's look at how Beethoven structures his theme in this movement that I gave you to look at. So this is the theme from the Beethoven movement that's at the end of your workbook. And if you did some analysis of this theme, which is a pretty typical theme, it's just a little short 16 measure thing that's going to be the impetus for all the variations, then you may have decided you wanted to tackle the issues of what is the actual form here. So if you look at the binary form, and I've got the A and the B and the A prime sections all marked there. And this is a very straightforward version of rounded binary form. It's got an A section that starts out in G major and then modulates to the key of D major, what we'd expect to happen. It's got a B section that takes some ideas from the A section and develops them very briefly over a little 4-measure stretch. And then it's got an abbreviated return of the A section as an A prime, where we actually don't modulate away from the key of G major. If we wanted to look at the phrase structure, then we'd see that this is really a piece that only has 2 different phrases going on in it. There's an A phrase that constitutes the A section and the A prime section, and then there's a B phrase that happens in the B section. And those phrases all have cadences, because one of the things we learn in this class is you're not a phrase in form class unless you have a cadence at the end. But we look and we can sort of see how this piece works. And you can see that the A section that takes up the first 8 measures creates a modulating parallel period. Right? Both phrases start out the same. One ends in a half cadence, one modulates to D major and ends in an authentic cadence. And we call the phrases A and A prime because since that second phrase doesn't have the same ending due to its modulation as the first phrase, we're going to call it A prime. And then the B section has its own unique phrase. And then the A prime section of our rounded binary form has what I've designated as an A double prime phrase, because it's a version of the opening phrase that cadences as a perfect authentic cadence in G major. But I really want to look today at melodic things and how a composer might use melodic variations on a theme as he goes about creating one of these sectional variation works. So I'm really just going to take the first phrase of the theme and look at that. So let's move ahead. So that first phrase lays out a very simple and very easy to recognize theme. That little dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum 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 ba-da-da. And then over the course of many variations, Beethoven finds ways to take that opening phrase and vary it. And of course he does it with all the other phrases as well, but I want to focus on that first 4-measure phrase, which actually will help you sort of, if you want to look beyond it, you'll be able to notice those aspects that are happening continuing throughout the variation. And I'm not going to play a recording of this, but I do invite you / encourage you to go online and listen to a recording of this piece. And it's a pretty sounding piece, so you should do that anyway. So if we look at the opening melody, it's in G major and it ends in a half cadence. And let's go for some big picture things first. It's in G major and it starts on the mediant scale degree, on B. And when it gets to the half cadence, it ends on the second scale degree, on A. So those are things that Beethoven is going to preserve in each variation. Likewise, the things that happen between that initial B and that cadential A are going to be preserved in some form as well. So what are those things? Well, the first little gesture in the melody is the repeated B and then the ABC. Dun, 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 da, da. And then the next thing is that moving up to the tonic through steps from E to F sharp to G. Bum, 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 ba, ba, bum, bum, bum. And then there's a little step progression over the second measure to the third measure that goes G, A, B. Yum, bum, 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 bum. And then there's that ending that comes down to the A through steps, C, B, A. Ba, da, da, da. So if you look at the first variation underneath, you can see how Beethoven varies that. You know, he puts in some 16th notes, he increases the rhythmic motion, but if you look at how those 16th notes are through tonal accent, through like, you know, the highest pitch, they emphasize B going up to C at the end of the first beat, just like happened in the theme, and that's what these arrows that are showing up are showing you. And then, you know, from the first full measure to the second measure, that F sharp G leading tone to tonic is kept. There's the F sharp at the end of the measure, and then there's the G in the middle of the first beat of the second measure. And at the end of the second measure, there's the A and the low D that happened. And then in the third measure, there's the B and the low D. And then that CBA approach to the half cadence happens as well at the end of the last full measure I'm showing you. So when watching those arrows, can you sort of see how the initial notes of the melody, can you see how those are embedded in that variation? Take your time and make sure you see it. Pause the screen if you need to, because this is the type of thing we're going to be looking for in all the subsequent variations we look at too. So make sure you get what I'm talking about. And here's what the first phrase looks like in the second variation, where Beethoven moves away from 16th notes to 16th note triplets. And again, you know, the first note of the melody is the B, which is the high note that he emphasizes at the end of his first triplet. And then there's the idea of going from A through C on the first beat, and you can see that happening at the end of the first triplet. And of course, the end of the first full measure is that E, F sharp that are going to approach the G by steps. And you can see the E and the F sharp both at the ends of the triplets there. At the beginning of the second full measure, there's our G. And at the end of the measure, you know, we're supposed to have a step progression that goes from G to A to B. So there's the A at the end of the measure, with the low D being preserved down the bottom. Really, that triplet just takes the notes in the theme and turns them into an arpeggio. And then moving into the last measure, you can see how that GB harmonic interval jumping down to D has become that triplet arpeggio. And then there's the C, B, and A approach to the half cadence. So, you know, again, you look inside at what Beethoven's doing, he's writing very, very different rhythms, and he's like writing these more active arpeggio figures. But they're managing to find a way to emphasize the scale degrees that highlight the melody in the first phrase of the theme. That whole idea of going B down to A, back up to C, then E, F sharp, G. You can see all that arrowed out in the relationship between this theme and the second variation. And it's going to be the same case with the third variation. Third variation might be a little bit easier to see, to tell the truth, because now he's writing a more complicated 16th note passage in the left hand, and if you look at the right hand in the treble clef, you'll see that it's being a little bit more true to outlining the basic aspects of the melody from the theme. In fact, this really reduces the melody from the theme down to its basics. A couple of eighth notes on B, then moving down to A at the beginning of the first full measure. And the important thing at the end of the first full measure is the E, F sharp that move up to the G at the beginning of the second full measure, which is part of a step progression that goes to A, and then to B, and to C. And it's a little bit different this time, but not so much different that it doesn't count as an easy to see variation. So variation 4 is that thing I told you all to expect in these sectional variation types. What we have is we have a parallel minor variation, right? Because the theme and all the other variations have been in G major. And suddenly here comes one in G minor. And if you look at what's going on, you see that Beethoven does a few very simple things to create this variation. One, like I said, he puts the darn thing in minor. The other thing he does is he writes both voices down low in the bass clef. He uses monophonic texture because they're just playing in octaves. And the way he treats the melody is very, very similar to how it's treated in the initial theme, because I guess he figures just putting it in a minor key is enough to create that sense of hearing the same thing repeated but altered, which is the essence of variation form. So if you look, you can see that these arrows that are showing up on the screen now are tracing very nicely how this variation takes the ideas from the initial theme and just puts them in a minor key, puts them in the parallel minor key. I'm not even putting arrows from every note, just basically from every beat. So you can see what's going on. That idea of starting on the third scale degree, going down to the second scale degree, doing pickups to the second measure that approach the tonic through stepwise motion, and then that step progression that goes scale degrees 1, 2, 3, and ending up to the half cadence, which happens as it's happened in every variation thus far. And here's variation 5, where Beethoven moves back to the key of G major, and again he's just writing a very ornamented version of his opening theme. He's using a 16th note accompaniment in the left hand, and he's put a little bit more rhythmic motion in the melodic voice in the right hand as well. But you can see how we're basically tracing out those same scale degrees in the melody. So, again, the arrows are trying to show what's staying the same in each variation, which are what sort of give it its recognizability as a variation form. And the thing you need to take note of is notice what's different. Basically notice the space between the arrows, because that is the variation, those things that Beethoven is adding each time to give us a sense of, we've heard this, but the composer's adapting it and varying it and adding to it each time, which is kind of what the name of the game is with variation procedures. And that brings us to the final variation, number 6. And as is the case with a lot of final variations, this one's got a whole heck of a lot of notes going on in it, because variation forms tend to move from simple to more complex, and they tend to get more farther removed from the theme as they go on, and that's certainly the case here. If you look at that initial opening phrase of the theme that I've kept at the top of each slide, then you can see how this variation doesn't bear very much superficial resemblance to it at all. The opening theme is just a bunch of little puny eighth notes and stuff that sound kind of nice and pretty, and the 6th variation is this passage of cascading 30-second notes that are running all over the keyboard. So over the course of 6 variations, Beethoven's really managed to change this up quite a lot. But look at those 30-second note passages. Notice the pitches they tend to emphasize by either placing them as the highest notes or placing them on the strong beats. And what you'll see is that often, those passages of a lot of notes on each beat tend to be coming back to the notes that were on those beats in the initial first phrase of the theme. So Beethoven's clearly still thinking about writing that melodic phrase, but just adding a lot of filigree melodically to it. Look at these last 2 measures I've got. If you look at the first beat of the second last measure, it starts on G, which is of course what we expect, and basically just runs up an octave to a high G. And then the second beat, which is part of a step progression that goes up by step to A, that happens on the second beat of the 30-second notes, where the highest note is A, and of course then it's no surprise that in the last full measure, where the high note in the melody is B, B is the highest note on the 32nd note passage as well. So Beethoven's doing a really good job of basically taking a simple melodic idea and showing us 6 different ways that that idea can be developed and made more complex and more interesting. And of course, the other thing that's happening too that we're not seeing on these slides, since I'm not showing you complete variation sections, is we're not seeing the idea that Beethoven's staying with that opening formal type he started with. All these variations are in rounded binary form and have like a modulating parallel period for their A sections, and he's basically staying true to those formal ideas as well. But really the purpose of today's lecture has been to have you look at how he's working with melodic ideas and how he's developing a melody and varying a melody by adding more notes to it. So if you don't get that, that's why we have rewind. So go back and check it again. And if you still don't get it, that's why we have email. So you can write me and say, I don't get it, and I will say something to you, which very well might be, did you rewind the video? But if you did, then I'll try to help you. So let's talk about what's happening for the next class. For the next class, not a lot's happening for me, yay, but a lot's happening for y'all because you have a test. So the test will be available by midnight on Wednesday, and you have until the end of the day Wednesday to get it turned in to me. You're not going to need 24 hours for it, but I want the test to get completed somewhere in that 24-hour window. As far as what's going to be on the test, it's going to cover the last 2 units in the book, 26 and 27, the ones on variation forms and imitative forms. And I can tell you right now that the thing that's going to be used to test you on imitative forms is that Bach fugue that's been sitting around on the internet for the past 5 days waiting for you to come to it. The F minor fugue from Well-Tempered Clavier Volume 1. It's on the Moodle page, it's on the Google Classroom page, and you're free to like print that out or whatever, study it as much as you want, analyze it to your heart's content, and bring the analysis you've done to the test with you. The only thing you can't do with it is don't look at any outside analyses of it. You know, don't go online and ask, you know, so how does this piece work or anything like that, because A, that's cheating and dishonest, and I don't dig that, and B, a lot of times the answers you get on the internet aren't right. So what I want you to do is analyze that F minor fugue based only on your knowledge of how imitative forms, in particular fugal forms, work, based on your reading in the textbook, your notes you've taken from these PowerPoint lectures I've been putting up. That'll be one part of the test. It'll have 2 pieces on it. It'll have the Bach F minor fugue for variation or for imitative forms, and then it's going to have something on there having to do with variation forms. Could be any type of thing we've looked at. So go back and review the unit on variation forms, look at the pieces in there. It could be a continuous variation form like the Bach Passacae. It could be a sectional variation form like the Mozart movement we looked at or the Beethoven movement we just looked at. And then in addition to that, there will be some short answer questions. So, like I say, you've got till the end of the day Wednesday. And even though Wednesday is a test day and we don't have a new lecture, something I'm going to put up on Wednesday for you all to access is a what to expect on the exam video. And it'll tell you exactly how the exam will be administered next week, and it will give you a sense of what the exam's going to cover. Basically, the exam's going to cover everything we've done this semester about form and analysis. So know everything there is from Unit 19 to the end of your book. And think about what questions you have. If you get them to me quickly enough, then I might be able to incorporate them into the what to expect on the exam video that will go up on Wednesday. We'll also maybe be sending some emails to see if you all want a live session on Zoom or something like that to review for the exam. So, go study for your test on this Wednesday, and wash your hands, stay healthy, and I'll catch you the next time. Take care.